Phantasy Star 4, The End of a Millennium. This is the final game in the Phantasy Star series, at least on the Genesis, that we can talk about. And boy did we save the best for last. This game feels like an amalgam of all of the good things from Phantasy Stars 2 and 3 with basically none of the bad, at least nothing to its own fault, I feel. And it might very well be the best RPG on the system. I mean, there's only two I haven't played on the entire Genesis, and so far this is the one that's impressed me the most. Heck, because of the giant ungodly tumor that's known as NGS, basically killing everything good about PSO2, I think by definition this is now the best Phantasy Star game. Now, I know you're probably going to defend Phantasy Star Online, and that's fair, but I really hate the way section IDs affected drops in that game, so I cannot in good conscience say that that was better than this. Phantasy Star 4 is a particularly weird game when it comes to game collecting. While I never saw a copy as a kid, as I understand, it was a very, very expensive game to buy, sitting at around $100 to purchase, to my understanding. And that was because apparently there was like a lot of extra development put into the cartridge itself. Fortunately, it doesn't come in a giant Virtua Racing cart, but apparently there was a lot of extra time and development put into this thing. And over the years, this was kind of known as a crown jewel of any Genesis collector's collection. When I started making videos about 10 years ago, I started getting into Genesis Collection because I never really did that, even though I had one as a kid. And even back then, this game had maintained its price at about $100, being an unfathomable sum of money, both for me then and now, but also compared to any other Genesis game, which, I mean, 10 years ago would have been like a 20th of the price. Ironically, nowadays, most Genesis games have come up to about $100 in price, which really sucks. But Phantasy Star 4, the crown jewel must-have of any Genesis collection if you're an RPG person, actually hasn't gone up in price at all, which is absolutely strange. You'd think because all the other Genesis games go up in price, this one, the one that's, you know, one of the more sought-after Genesis carts out there, would in turn go up exponentially, but no, it's actually maintained its price. And because of that, I would say it's one of the more easily recommendable games on the system, just on average prices alone. Because, well, a lot of lesser titles have gone up to this price, this amazing game still has maintained it. Collecting games is weird sometimes. Now, the story to Phantasy Star 4 is fairly impressive for its time. For one thing, it tries to amalgamate the stories of Phantasy Star 1 through 3 into a single linear narrative, with this being the climactic finale. This is impressive because, to my understanding, basically everyone who worked on Phantasy Star 3 were a completely different group of people than the people who worked on Phantasy Stars 1 and 2, and I believe it because Phantasy Star 3 felt wildly different. This one tries to connect all of the stories, including all potential 4 endings of Phantasy Star 3, into a single narrative that kinda makes sense. And it finishes with an adventure that has a scope and scale unlike anything the series has ever done before. It's thoroughly impressive and it's very well told. The story stars Alice Bragwin, hunter extraordinaire. And she likes to fight with slashers, so she's a bit like that one mercenary girl from Phantasy Star 2 I really like. She and her young apprentice Chaz are hired to go save a university from a bit of a monster problem in the basement. After finding a hanger-on in the form of one of their students, she proceeds to fleece him out of all of his wedding funds in triplicate. I love this lady. Like, I'm just gonna say it. Ain't no one ever gonna replace Risa, but I think we found runner-up best girl for Phantasy Star. While tracking down the source of these monsters to a cave, they come across a town that's been completely wiped out by this cult leader named Zio. Here is where you meet Rune. Rune is some sort of all-knowing mage-y type guy, and it's pretty clear Alice has a bit of a thing for him, and Chaz does not approve. And this is why no one likes you, Chaz. You won't let Alice have any fun. Either way, they go to this mysterious cave, and after a bit of a detour in the form of trying to both cure petrification, but also add some weird moth guy who fights with an axe to the party, you make your way into this cave only to learn that it's some sort of mysterious, ancient, advanced technology something. And it's from here you meet Rika, the literal Ney clone, which unfortunately does mean that Ney's final wish was never actually heard or acted upon, which in turn makes all of Phantasy Star 2's story even more heartbreaking. But I mean, I guess Newman's had to continue to exist in Phantasy Star Online, because Pioneer 2 had a giant surplus of big goofy hats. and I wasn't wearing them. But she reveals that everything going on this planet, including all of the monsters, is the result of the environment being thrown out of whack because of all the computers that are controlling the environment on this planet going haywire. And this Zeo fella must have something to do with it. So you add an A 3.0 to your party, and you go around the world trying to figure out how to solve all of these problems and save the world from its own catastrophic environmental disaster. Because once again, Phantasy Star was warning us about actually doing something about the environment, and no one listened. But of course, it's never that simple, and from there the story expands greatly. Like I said at the top, the plot to Phantasy Star 4 is of a scope and scale that really none of the other games before this have even tried to do. And every time I thought I was getting close to the end, it would be all like, surprise! You're not even close to the end yet. But I killed the big, like, Diablo thing. How am I not done yet? Clearly that was the final boss. No? Okay. Yeah, this game kind of seems to go on a lot longer than you necessarily expected, and I don't mean that as a bad thing. It was a surprise to see this game expand further and further, and to see how big this game actually got. And the writing has clearly improved from the previous games because, I mean, for one thing, there's actual writing for the characters. Like, if you go back to Phantasy Star 2 for a minute, with the exception of Nay and, I guess, the protagonist, basically every single character had like one line of introductory text, one line in the end screen, and that was your lot. Here, your characters are going to be talking all over the place in every single cutscene because first of all, there's a lot more cutscenes. But second of all, you get a greater sense of how deep and interesting these characters actually are. And you get a sense that every single character has a connection to one another and has opinions on different topics. For example, like I said at the top, Chaz does not approve of Rune, and once Rune really gets added to your party, you can kind of see them going at it the entire time. But not only are they actively squabbling with each other, there's something else going on in the background which makes the writing even more impressive. This game's got character development. Okay, there's one really big thing in the game that really does develop one of the characters, but I won't talk too much about that. What I mean is, again, going back to my example of Rune and Chaz, because they're two of the most developed characters in terms of interpersonal relationships. When they start together, they openly hate each other. Chaz does not like Rune, and maybe this is my own interpretation of it as to why, but Chaz seems to think that Rune is very full of himself, very condescending. It feels like his position is threatened as being Alice's companion. You know, he sees that Alice has a thing for Rune, and that Rune is threatening his ability to spend time with his mentor. But there's one other big thing going on here that I noticed, and that is that I think Chaz sees that Rune has a point. See, from Rune's perspective, he tells Chaz pretty much flat out, you're holding Alice back, you don't know what you're doing, you're not strong, you're not equipped, and you're too hot-headed to think things through, so you're gonna do something seriously bad and you're gonna get everyone killed. And I think Chaz understands that and agrees, but he doesn't want to say it out loud, and he takes his frustration out on Rune for being, you know, a condescending, pompous ass. And over the course of the game, they make their open animosity towards one another very well known, and yet by the end of it, while they're still actively at each other's throats, it really just seems like more of a running joke at that point than anything. Like, it seems like that's more friendly ribbing, just taking shots at each other, more than open animosity towards one another, and you can see them grow from sort of an active hatred of one another to more of a older brother looking out for the younger brother type of situation, you know? It was cool to see these characters grow and see them actually kind of become friends. In one cutscene, you actually see them openly grinning at each other while they're kind of giving each other a bad time, and it felt like these were actual characters, and I love that. It feels like their characters really did grow and change. Likewise, you do get a sense of emotion in the writing, which for the most part Phantasy Star really hasn't had up to this point. You can see the emotion on their faces when they're talking, and it feels like the emotion in the writing itself is being drawn out more and more, not just thanks to those cut-ins, but also just because the writing has gotten so much better over the course of the games. The plot is absolutely engaging, the characters are great, and there are twists and turns that even I didn't see coming, and two very big ones I absolutely did see coming, but I won't spoil them because you really should play this. That said, the story isn't perfect. You know, aside from the plot twists I did see coming that felt very, very blatant in their foreshadowing, but there were two issues that kind of happened at about the same time that I feel like were awkward additions to the story that could have probably been cut and nothing really would have been lost. Spoilers, but there are vehicles in this game like every other Phantasy Star before it. And at one point, there's a chapter that starts with you getting a vehicle, wrecking it, and then you walk for 10 minutes to get an identical vehicle and then leave and go where you were supposed to go. Nothing of meaning happens between those 2 points. It's just a chapter where you wrecked a vehicle and you got an identical vehicle to continue what you were doing, and nothing really happened. Why did that chapter need to exist there? The only thing that happens in that chapter is at the very start, when you crash your vehicle, you get a new party member, but like, couldn't you have just contrived it so that I got where I needed to go and then got my party member? Why did I need to waste 10 minutes walking and doing nothing? This chapter made absolutely no sense. So yes, the writing is not perfect in Phantasy Star 4, but it's on a scope and scale that has not been seen before. There's character growth and development, there's emotion, there's plot twists abound, and it is just a very impressively written game. I don't think there's another game on the Genesis that has this much writing in it. At least not in English, because of course writing takes up space and it's easier to write more stuff in Japanese than English, but I just haven't seen a game with this much dialogue in it on the Genesis. This is genuinely, on a technical level, very impressive, and it's impressive how much time and effort they went into writing this story and its characters, and how much they were willing to develop these characters in it. This game is kind of in a league of its own, at least on the Genesis. Oh, and before I forget, Ren's back! And he's just as much an awesome tank as he was in the previous game. And hey, they addressed one of my problems from the previous game. He admits he's an android, not a cyborg. This game's actively hearing my problems with the previous games and fixing them. So yeah, the writing in this game's kind of in a class of its own. The gameplay to Phantasy Star 4 feels basically like the others, although a strict upgrade from the lot. Similarly to previous games, it's a fairly standard turn-based RPG. You can walk around and talk to NPCs, and sometimes some of your side characters will actually interject and comment on the situation, which makes just getting flavor text from NPCs feel a lot more dynamic, and it makes your characters actually feel like they're part of this world. That's a huge step forward for realism, I think. Unlike the originals, there's actually kind of some side quests here. Not a lot, mind you, but still, considering that the previous ones didn't really have much beyond critical path stuff, the fact that this game introduces the Hunter's Guild, which allows you to utilize your ability as a mercenary to earn a little bit extra money by taking down bosses and the like, is definitely appreciated. I didn't play too much of this part though, honestly, because I was swimming in Meseta. I had so much money that I wasn't using, and yeah, this was kind of an underwhelming reward for, side quests. Going into combat, it is basically a standard upgrade of everything we've seen thus far. It's turn-based, every character has skills as well as techniques that are exclusive to them. Techniques utilizing a magic point system, whereas skills just can be used X number of times before they need to rest at an inn. One thing that was fairly interesting to note is there's no auto battle function anymore. They've completely removed that, and instead you can target whatever enemies you want, which makes it feel like combat is a lot more hands-on. But if you did like the auto battle system, don't worry, there's still something here for you. It's just a little bit more in depth. They added combat macros so you can actually program your teammates into doing whatever you want and basically shortcut the entire fight to being like one button press every single turn. As well, they've made things a little bit more in depth because if certain characters use certain skills or techniques in conjunction with other characters at the same time, they'll actually perform a super move combining their abilities into one, sort of like the double text from Chrono Trigger. The big difference between the two is Chrono Trigger, they're basically just given to you once you have enough points. Here you actually have to discover what these combinations are on your own, and it sort of becomes an explorative and experimentative puzzle. I didn't find too many of these, but when I did find them, I was so jazzed to see that they were there. That was really fun to find out. Another small change from Phantasy Star 3. You don't have to actively go and find a different shopkeeper in order to remove status afflictions, which is a godsend because that was such a waste of time. And what's even better, there aren't locations that will definitely give you those status afflictions, but not have a shopkeeper to go get those status afflictions removed, because that desert in Phantasy Star 3 kinda sucked. Now you just gotta go hang out at an inn and you're fine. It's honestly more of a simplification and regression than anything, but it is appreciated. Other improvements over previous iterations of the game? Well, when the game tells you how many technique points it is to use a magic skill, it uses that many. I still don't understand why Phantasy Star 3 did that. And if you go to a store, You actually know exactly what characters can equip what pieces of equipment. So it's better than Phantasy Star 2 as well. Those are very small changes, but they go a long way for quality of life, and I definitely appreciate it. And fortunately, the dungeons don't ever really feel like they get dumb or confusing. There certainly isn't an issue of having to grind between floors in any of them. And they start out very simple, although later on they do get substantially more complex. It's a nice series of dungeons that don't ever get too wild and are just fun to explore. Overall, Phantasy Star 4, in terms of gameplay, is a fairly standard RPG, but it threw out all the obtuseness and things that didn't work from the previous games, for the most part. And really, there's only one big issue I had here. Maybe this was just the way I played, or maybe I got some like really unlucky spawns across the entirety of the game, but I found that the enemy scaling and the difficulty curve was a bit out of whack. Like, it was fine up until you get to the technology cave where Rika hangs out, sort of at the end of the tutorial, more or less. At that point, enemies just felt like they ramped up in terms of difficulty and stats. And, I mean, that's fine. Enemies getting harder from new areas is nothing new. That's basically every RPG ever. But then I went to the next area, and it felt like another huge jump up. And across the entire game, it never really felt like it stopped making these sort of radical escalations in enemy strength. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking something along the lines of, well, Fury, you were just underleveled. You need to grind a lot more. This is Phantasy Star. Do you know how much you have to grind in Phantasy Star 2? Yes, I do, because I had to play that game. And while it's certainly nowhere near as bad as having to grind between floors in singular dungeons, I thought about that too. I actually sat down and spent a couple hours grinding out 10 levels for every character in my party, and I knew I was well ahead of the curve at this point, because I actually got a different party member to join, and they were well behind me. But the thing is, enemies still hit really hard. Around about the halfway point of the game, it really started hitting me that individual enemies in standard random encounters were taking like 60 to 80% of my health for single characters in singular attacks sometimes. And my characters had pretty much the best equipment I could find and buy. And I was exploring pretty thoroughly, and I wasn't finding anything remotely better. There were a couple of pieces of equipment that gave my androids extra abilities, that's really cool, but nothing that gave me substantially more health and defense. And pretty much after every standard random encounter, I'd have to pause, stop the game, go through the menus, heal up Rune at least, because he's a mage and he takes a lot of damage very quickly, and the enemies seem to actively target him more than anyone else, or at least in my experience they did. And that was just standard fights. Standard fights would be punctuated with me not cheering because I got money and experience or I got a random weapon drop, because sometimes that happens, and that's pretty cool. No, it was really more just a groan that I had to go into the menus and heal everyone up again, and then run into another fight because, like all the other Phantasy Star games, the encounter rate's a tad high. Boss fights as well are pretty bad on the back half of this game. It's just in general feel like healing items spam in order to stay alive as you slowly chip away at them. Again, maybe I just got like the wrong random encounters across the entire game, but the enemies seem to be scaled very, very strong for this compared to the other games, even after all the grinding I did. Some of the enemies themselves are just kind of weird in terms of their drops and stats as well. Right around where I started trying to do that like 10 level grind for a couple hours, there's this one enemy that kind of sucks to fight. It's this big green scorpion, and it can take a fair bit of punishments. For every single one you kill, you get one Mistetta for killing it. Don't get me wrong, I've got a ton of it, but if I'm not getting much money out of this fight, could I at least get like an exponential amount of experience or something? It's just weird to see that I made no money fighting this rather tough enemy. And have you ever thought to yourself, man, I'm playing this RPG and I've got this awesome vehicle, but like, I just can't fight enemies in it? Doesn't it make more sense to fight enemies with like this giant tank around me because I've got like these giant walls of defense around me? No, I'm just gonna step out and hit them with a sword. Okay. Yeah, Phantasy Star 4 doesn't do that. You get a tank, you can fight enemies in a tank, and you get a whole different GUI for it and skill set, and it's full of palette cycling. And I love my palette cycling. So yeah, Phantasy Star 4 is also kind of unofficially a Metal Max game. It's awesome. The overall presentation to Phantasy Star 4 is excellent. Like a lot of other aspects to this game, it kind of combines the more positive aspects of Phantasy Star 2 and Phantasy Star 3. For example, in combat. Like Phantasy Star 2, you can see your characters on screen and enemies animate. But like Phantasy Star 3, you get bespoke environments. Between these two games, it really does create sort of the optimal visual combat experience. It also seems to take the graphical detail of Phantasy Star 3, but with the more bombastic and loud colors of Phantasy Star 2, which makes it a lot more visually memorable. And hey, I actually recognize a lot of these enemies from Phantasy Star Online. For example, these giant mantises. These were in the cave levels of Phantasy Star Online. And hey, they've got those enemies that you can bifurcate and turn them into two enemies. They're here too. There's actually quite a few Phantasy Star references that would be in later games, which gives me a lot more respect for them, seeing them here, and this was actually their origin. That's very, very cool. The only thing visually I don't necessarily like about this game is the fact that the maps are a little bit easy to get lost. I know when I got the really good vehicle that lets you go over the water and basically go anywhere, I knew that I had to go to one specific place on the planet and I could not find it. And there's no in-game map as far as I can tell. So it is a little bit lacking compared to Phantasy Star 3 in that regard, but their map wasn't very good to begin with either. So, you know, it's a little bit awkward, but everything looks very, very good. I will say it's not the nicest Genesis game I've ever seen. There are a few I think would look a little bit better at times, such as but the constant use of manga-style panel cut-ins and character animations and everything really tie this together to really show that this is one of the nicest looking Genesis games and easily the nicest looking Phantasy Star game on the system, and possibly like the best straight up RPG this system ever got. And audio wise, the soundtrack is pretty solid as well. I quite enjoy this soundtrack, although I will say I don't think it's quite as memorable as some of the other songs from like Phantasy Star 2. But I'd also be lying if I didn't tell you that I actually idled this game on its title screen through 2 or 3 loops just to rock out to the title screen. The music in this game is really, really good. Overall, the presentation to Phantasy Star 4 is pretty awesome and definitely one of the upper class games on the Genesis. They put all the work in the world into the visuals, the gameplay, everything. Now, if you want a copy of Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, on the Sega Genesis, cheapest copy I see right now is about $100, and that's sort of where it's hovered around pretty much since its launch. Like I said, back in the day, the way this game sold was very, very weird, and it's strange to me that to this day it hasn't really increased in price, but everything else has kind of risen to meet it at that price point for some reason. Either way, this copy was actually sent to me on Steam, and you can get it there as part of the Sonic Genesis collection thing that seems to have had all the Sonic games gutted from it because they wanted to really sell Sonic Origin to you. Thanks, Sega, for that, by the way. But if you want it there, it's actually only a couple of dollars as a DLC, or you could buy the whole collection on basically any other console, and you should still at least have Sonic in them, because I'm pretty sure it's just the Steam version that had Sonic gutted from it, and that's kind of crap. But if you buy this individually for DLC for the collection, it's only like $2 or $3. Honestly, I think it's worth it. I'm someone who wants to own every Genesis RPG, and to my knowledge, I think I'm only missing 2, 3 if you count Shining in the Darkness, I guess. But this one is by far the most expensive that I own, and I have to say it was well worth it. This game cost an absurd sum of money at launch. It cost an absurd sum of money 10 years ago. It costs an absurd sum of money now, except all the other Genesis games I seem to find cost about the same. It's weird that this game hasn't really gone up in price. If any one Genesis game was worth the absurd sum of money of $100+, it would be Phantasy Star 4. And Musha. God, I wish I had Musha. But Phantasy Star 4, it's not only an amazing way to wrap up this series, the fact that it does manage to wrap up all the series up to this point in a relatively satisfying story with excellent gameplay, with the only real issues I found to be the somewhat abnormally strong enemies. It was a lot of fun, and I can highly recommend it. Now the only question is, what do I do for my next Phantasy Star game? I mean, I've already done online in the Genesis games, and Phantasy Star Online 2. I mean, I guess I could do NGS, but NGS makes me want to cry, so, no. I could do card, That was a weird game. If I found some money, maybe we could go after the original Phantasy Star on the SMS. That could be kind of interesting because I've never actually played that one. Might have to look into that. Might have to find some funding to do it. But the point is, Phantasy Star has been a fun little experience for me. I never played any of these Genesis games. And thanks to someone being very generous, I've now gotten to play all three. I can see why fans of RPGs would try and flaunt these as much as possible to the Super Nintendo fans. No, it's not going to be Chrono Trigger anytime soon. It would be a very big uphill battle to try and fight Final Fantasy. But if any RPG could on the Genesis, it would be Phantasy Star 4.